Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker. It is an issue over the last 30 years that has caused bitter debate: climate change. And for much of that time, we have basically heard one viewpoint, that the globe is warming dangerously, and if we don't hurry up and get a handle on it, the planet may be doomed. But increasingly, people are questioning the foundation of those claims, and one of them is Steve Koonin. For a long time, he was a believer. He was an undersecretary in the Department of Energy under President Obama and received a PhD theoretical physics from MIT, taught theoretical physics at Caltech, professor at NYU, member of the National Academy of Science, now at Stanford. He is a voice worth hearing, author of a best-selling book on climate change called Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters, published in 2021. Steve Koonin joins me on Newsmaker. Great to see you again.
Good to be chatting with you, John.
Steve, tell me if I'm wrong, but it appears there's been a shift, that the climate change Armageddon narrative is coming unraveled a bit. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I would say that there has been a sea change, and people are starting to appreciate the underlying reality of what climate science tells us and what it doesn't, as well as the reality of the energy system that some people are trying to change drastically.
So with those two things being top of mind, we've got these competing, colliding interests about carbon emissions, which, you know, largely, at least since the industrial age, there's a big contributor from gas burning, fossil fuel burning industry. But then we've got this desperate need now for energy. And those two now are butting heads, because we've got, you use the term, the wolf at your door, and that right now may be energy need.
Absolutely. And that growing energy need comes in two forms. One is, you would estimate about half of the world does not have adequate energy to live a modern civilized life. And so as they develop, they need more energy. And here in the US, or more generally in the developed world, we now have the need to supply energy for data centers. Artificial intelligence is rapidly becoming a very useful tool for a lot of people, and that technology requires tremendous amounts of electricity.
And AI, interestingly, could help us get out of this climate dilemma, right?
Yes, I believe that that's the case. AI will help us in many ways in terms of trying to project what future climates are, and in terms of managing the current energy systems better than we do right now.
Steve, a couple of things have happened in recent years, and even recently, like within the last couple of months, from Bill Gates walking back his predictions of climate doom to many countries scaling back climate pledges. I think of New Zealand, Australia, the US, the UK, and then John Clauser, who won the Physics Nobel Prize in 2022, when he stated, "I can very confidently assert there is no climate emergency. And as much as that may upset many people, my message is the planet is not in peril."
That's certainly true. You know, those statements could have been made and were made by more than a few people even 2 decades ago. The notion that we face an existential risk is just not tenable, and is just not supported by the science. At the same time, humans are influencing the climate, and you know, we should not ignore that fact, but we should not be overturning all of society in order to reduce our influences on the climate.
How did we get here? And it strikes me that academia has really been kind of the clearinghouse for all of this. And academia has been in lockstep on the message that this is a catastrophe waiting to happen. What is the reason for that? Why is academia so dug in on this climate notion that we're facing a crisis?
Well, you know, the apparent lockstep that you mention in academia is due only to the fact that people who did not go along have been pushed out or have been marginalized. And I think for the bulk of academia, it's a wonderful issue. It's an alleged threat to civilization. We need more research, both in climate science and energy, to deal with it. And there's a lot of profit to be made in a professional sense by promoting those ideas.
And does that go for the institutions as well? Not just the scientists doing the research, but the institutions?
Oh, absolutely. You have centers and even whole schools within universities getting stood up to fight climate change.
And it is one of the burgeoning areas of education now, right? Handing out climate science degrees.
Sure, you can get a degree in climate science and environmental science, in climate communications. And, you know, it's really interesting to speculate how those things are going to change, given that the zeitgeist is shifting to a much more realistic picture of how important this is or isn't.
Steve, when you wrote your book, Unsettled, what was the reaction within academia and at your institution? At that time, I think it was NYU, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So what kind of backlash did you face?
Yeah, within academia, within my own institution, at the administrative level, I knew the president and provost and the deans. I think to their credit, there was support. Steve, we may not agree with what you're saying, but we think it's very important that you have the right to say it. As you got down lower in the institution, I think there was a shunning that went on. You don't get invited to various things. You're not there teaching the appropriate classes, things of that sort. More broadly, I was gratified that many people would write to me privately and say, Steve, thanks for speaking out on this.
Academics writing you?
Yes, privately. In email.
Okay, so this idea that 97% of scientists agree on this whole thing, I mean, we could go back to the genesis of that, which was a survey that was, frankly, a sham. That's putting it mildly. It's not representative. So you're telling me that within academia, there are many people who share your view and say, we've got to be cautious here.
Absolutely. And, you know, those are people from some of the country's most prestigious institutions. But there is a penalty for speaking out, even to say, I support some other faculty member. So it really did become quite pernicious, and much to my surprise and disappointment.
Okay. You still teach, and you're at Stanford. So what do you tell a group of college students that despite what they've heard their whole life, that we are in a crisis and that the science is settled?
The most effective thing to do is, first of all, to show them the data, what's happened in the last 120 years as the globe has warmed about as much as we expect it to warm in the next 100 years. And of course, the statistics, which I won't go through in detail, tell us that humanity has prospered like never before. And then you show them the official projections of economic damage over the next 100 years. And again, it's minimal. It's a couple years worth of development or a fraction of the growth in the GDP. I show them the data on how much sea level has risen over the last 100 years. And when confronted with those facts, I think cognitive dissonance starts to set in for them. And many of them come away with at least a better critical sense, if not a changed mind about the kind of alleged emergency that we're facing.
I want to put up graphic 1 here if I can, because this is what people face every day on Twitter or social media. It's a barrage of hyperbolic, CO2 levels must fall or mankind will. Yeah. And when you're given that message repeatedly over and over, and from storied publications like the New York Times and Washington Post, it starts to become truth. And the science is utterly obliterated.
Check the facts for yourself. How much is sea level going up? How much is temperature gone up? What have been the economic impacts of a warming globe? And, think critically. I try to appeal to their innate sense of skepticism.
Okay, so let's take a couple of those. Data. It's all in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In Working Group 1, which does the actual science, to me, that's where the truth resides. The rest of it is spin, frankly. It's kind of a PR campaign to force action. That's my take.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. And Working Group 1, when you read the detailed reports themselves, which amount to, I don't know, 600-700 pages of pretty dense technical stuff, it's not bad. But when you get to the summary for policymakers, or the summaries of all the reports for policymakers, there you see the spin being applied, and applied pretty heavily.
And sadly, and I can say this because I'm in this field, the journalists only read the summary.
Oh, at best, I would say. Maybe they even just read the press releases. So this is a complicated, nuanced topic, and it's rare, if not unprecedented, to find a journalist who's willing to dig in deeply enough to ask good questions.
Well, I can tell you in newsrooms, it doesn't make you very popular if you start doubting the narrative.
Yeah. In fact, there's a whole organization, as you may well know, called Covering Climate Now.
I know them well. I get emails from them all the time.
And I believe that that's a travesty.
Yeah, they're trying to kind of guide our coverage on everything. The predictions over the years. This is where the skepticism for me in the crisis narrative. Not that we're warming, that's indisputable. We are warming. Oil gone in 10 years. That was 1966. Ice age by 2000. That was in 1970. That prediction came out. Oil depleted in 20 years. 1988. Maldive Islands will be underwater by 2018. New York City's West Side Highway will be underwater by 2019. They made that prediction in 1989. Children won't know what snow is. That was in 2000. Arctic will be ice-free by 2018. That prediction was made in 2008. If the predictions weren't so pathetic, they might have some credibility on the crisis narrative. But they're like 0 for 60.
You know, the last one you mentioned about the ice-free Arctic, you know, the Arctic ice did go down up until about 15 years ago, and it has not changed in 15 years.
Despite carbon, CO2 increasing.
You know, much more carbon in the atmosphere.
So how do you explain that? How does this points
the predictions are just wrong, okay?
Or natural variability.
The changes, yes, natural variability, absolutely. One of the central challenges in climate science is trying to separate natural variability from changes due to human influences. And if we look at the long historical records before human influences were significant, we see so much natural variability.
Steve, you believe the planet is warming. That's not in dispute.
Absolutely. The average temperature is going up.
This came from University of Arizona, was one of the contributors to this. This looks at the historical record of temperatures of the globe since it formed. What do you see here?
Well, I see a lot of variability. I see in the last couple of million years ice ages that are due to the Earth's orbit around the sun and the way the Earth tilts due to astronomical phenomena. But I see that globally we are at an unprecedented low over the last many millions of years.
This was published in the Washington Post. They put this out, and it got a lot of attention, and it got a lot of people angry. Yeah. What it says to me, just looking at it at the face of it, is we are not in a historically warm, unbearable period. Quite the opposite.
No, that's true. And even, you know, this is a scale of hundreds of millions of years, but even within the last couple 100,000 years, we're not unprecedentedly warm. During the last, what's called an interglacial, 125,000 years ago, the globe was a couple degrees centigrade warmer than it is now, and sea level was about 6 meters or 18 feet higher than it is now. So there's a lot of natural variability in the system.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We're with Steve Koonin. He's the author of Unsettled, What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. We're back with Steve Koonin, physicist, I would say an expert in this area, and we will rejoin Steve in just a moment. Welcome back on Newsmaker. Steve Koonin, physicist and author, one of the authors of a review for the Department of Energy under Secretary Chris Wright that was just put out on where we kind of stand on climate science. Steve is at Stanford University now, Hoover Institution. Steve, thanks again. You guys put out this report, and you concluded, namely, that CO2-induced warming appears to be less damaging economically than commonly believed, and aggressive mitigation strategies may be misdirected, and U.S. policy actions would have small direct impacts on global climate. That was one of the findings.
Yes, and you know, that is a straightforward conclusion from the data and from the facts. And in fact, the minimal economic damage was there in a report issued by the Biden White House in 2023. So in that sense, we're not saying anything that should surprise anybody, since it's right out of the IPCC and it's right out of the Biden White House.
Okay, that's the economic effect. What about effect on the planet?
Oh, that's a question of numbers again. The U.S. is something like 15% of global carbon dioxide emissions. Even if we went to zero tomorrow, it would be swamped. That decrease would be swamped by the growing emissions of the developing world.
So the politicians argue, well, we've got to set an example for the world.
Yeah,
but that comes with a price tag that is debatable because you've got to make choices.
I mean, certainly it's going, if we were to do that, it would make energy much more expensive. And it rests on the belief that the rest of the world is willing to follow our example. And I think increasingly that just isn't the case. The two outstanding examples of why that argument fails are the UK and Germany, which have had very aggressive emissions reduction policies, and their economies, and particularly their industrial sectors, are in the toilet over the last many years.
Okay, you put out this report, and it was very interesting. But wow, did it get savaged? Politico went scorched earth on you guys. You had 85 eminent scientists saying this is bunk, these guys are misreading the data, they're cherry picking. How do you respond to the criticism of your work? It was you, Judith Curry, Ross McKittrick, John Christie, Roy Spencer.
Correct. You know, I first like to think of a famous quote from Einstein when Nazi Germany was criticizing his Jewish physics. And Einstein said, you know, if I were really wrong, it would have taken only one person to prove that. The intensity of the reaction that took place, I think tells you that we were taking flack because we were over the target. Let me say that in the spirit of open scientific discussion and debate, we're in the process of re-looking at our report and responding to the critics, making changes or not as might be responsive to the criticisms. And I can tell you that there are very few changes in this revised report, which we hope to put out sometime early in the new year.
Steve, why was this report necessary?
Well, I mean, it is necessary, was necessary for some of the reasons we've been discussing. Now, there is a reluctance on the part of scientists and certainly on the part of much of the media to say anything or argue in any way against the notion that the climate's broken and we have to take immediate action. And I think Secretary Wright's motivation when he charged us was to cover areas of climate science that are not very well known to the public or decision makers.
When I interview politicians on this subject, I am frankly aghast at how little they know the data. It's shocking.
It's a complicated, nuanced subject, and unless you've taken the time to educate yourself, you're just not going to be right in what you're thinking. And one of the motivations for me to write Unsettled and then this report, which is like the book on steroids in my mind, was to try to educate non-experts about what the science is really saying.
And it gets back to your premise of your book, what we know, what we don't know, and why it matters.
Right.
Give me a read on the role of climate models. Some assail them, then you get stuff on Twitter where they say, no, they've been remarkably accurate. But they generally run hot, right?
That's correct. So the climate models are an important tool because they help us project what future climates might be. But when you look at their ability to reproduce the past climates, or their agreement one with the other in many different variables describing the climate, that they just don't agree with one another, nor with the observations at the level important for deciding about our climate futures. And so even though I grew up modeling complicated systems on computers, I tend to look askance at many of the model projections.
Steve, the Little Ice Age happened. It was a 500-year period of very inhospitable climate. The Thames froze over in London. It was not a very nice time to be alive. It was a 500-year period that ended in the mid-1980s. Famine, death, crop failures, decline in population. Would we not expect coming out of the Little Ice Age in the 1800s that we would have some degree of warming on the rebound? And we've warmed 1.3 degrees in that time, right?
Right. Yeah, and you know, it's an embarrassment for climate science that we don't really understand what caused the Little Ice Age. And it's certainly an embarrassment then to say that the current warming may or may not be partially a rebound from that. On the other hand, we do see other signatures, particularly of the radiation flowing in and out of the Earth, that suggest that some of the warming is due to carbon dioxide. The way I like to say it is human influences on climate ain't everything, but they ain't nothing either.
Okay, so you got to keep an eye on it. And you're a believer
absolutely.
in that.
And one of the most important things we need to do going forward is to keep observing the climate with satellites, ground stations, floats in the ocean, in order to better understand what's going on.
Here in Arizona, we worry a lot about temperatures here that are rising, but they're rising much faster than the 1.3 degrees globally. This strikes me, particularly because the overnight lows are the big sweet spot that we see rises in temperature. Overnight lows, that's changing the whole dynamic of our mean temperature. That strikes me as classic urban heat island, trapping the heat in all the asphalt and concrete.
Yeah, and that's certainly a big part of what people experience because most of the people live in urban areas. And to get at the science, you've got to take the urban heat island out of the picture and look at temperatures in pretty undeveloped areas. When you do that, you do see that the colder temperatures around the globe, namely nighttime, are warming faster than the warmer temperatures, which would be expected actually from increasing carbon dioxide. But the urban warming is much stronger and more pervasive than the general warming of the globe. That's certainly true.
Okay, Steve, we're going to continue on online. I want to continue on for a few more minutes if we can, but we're going to have to wrap it here on Newsmaker. Steve Koonin, great to see you. I appreciate your time and continued success in California. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker.